Remember the Blue Day book, that collection of cute animal photos with funny captions that went on to sell more than 20 million copies around the world? Well, its author Bradley Trevor Greive is back with a new way to make you smile, with curses and blessings for all occasions. BTG, welcome to Booktopia.
Thank you, Caroline. It's a pleasure to be back. When I flew into Sydney Harbour, I felt a little bit like Xenophon, 400 BC, after the Persian expedition, thinking, the sea, the sea. It's nice to be home.
You have an endorsement on the back cover that many would envy from John Cleese.
Is it an endorsement or a public evisceration?
How did you get it?
John Cleese and I met through conservation circles, actually. We're both life benefactors of the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust in Jersey, and I actually dedicated one of my books, Priceless, to Gerald Durrell's memory. And we're both passionate about wildlife conservation, wildlife and wild places. We've been friends for some time. In fact, he came out to Australia about 6-7 years ago as my guest, and I produced 2 shows for him, one here in Sydney and one in Dubbo, and all the proceeds went to the Taronga Foundation. So we go back a long way, and I have sort of been off the scene for about 2 years, took a little break and wandered through the Americas. And this little book, is it a book? I'm thinking of it more of as a pamphlet. I like to think I enjoyed the pamphleteers. I'd like people to compare me to Thomas Paine and Jonathan Swift.
Well, I think one of the things that links this book to John Cleese is that, for my money, the illustrations have a kind of Python-esque aesthetic.
Thank you. They have a very Terry Gilliam-esque feel. Well, not a lot of people know this, but I actually collect vintage wildlife etchings and have now quite a substantial collection. None of which has ever been on display other than in my own home, but little pieces. I started off with a collection of German butterflies, and then it grew and grew and grew. And there are some wonderful vintage print dealers in Australia. Melbourne in particular has some great ones. There's a couple in Hobart and some in Sydney. And I've also been dealing with some people offshore in the US and the UK. But I'm fascinated by etchings because they're such an exquisite, 3-phase art form, in that the creation of the image is basically sculpted. And then, of course, it's another art form to actually transfer that image by whatever medium onto paper or whatever. And as an art form, it goes way back. I mean, we're not even sure if it started in Mesopotamia or with the Aztecs. We see examples the entire way, but we do know, and where I picked up on it, was that in the Renaissance, the Fiorentinos really raised it to an art form. And from there, it took off. It was refined by leather-panted Germans and then perfected by a Dutchman by the name of Hendrik Goltzius. And he was a very interesting fellow because even as an infant, he seemed destined for something unusual because he rolled into a fire and he scorched his right hand rather cruelly, twisted into this deformed claw. But as it turned out, he had great artistic talent, and his hand was perfectly shaped to hold the burin, which is the carving tool with which one creates the etching plate. And his works have never been surpassed, though often copied. I don't own any Goltzius works, I wish I did, but I have thousands of these, and I just thought, wouldn't it be great to celebrate this art form by lowering it in tone, pretty much to what if Marcus Aurelius told a bum joke? And so that was pretty much the departure point for this book.
So, you've done illustrations before. You love drawing cartoons, don't you?
That's right. I was the youngest feature cartoonist for the Sydney Morning Herald back in sometime in the last century. And I continue to illustrate and cartoon to this day. I've just illustrated a book for Libby Gore for ABC Books called The Bedtime Poem for Edible Children. That's my first illustrated book. And I also continue to this day to produce a daily cartoon feature for Go Comics, which is about 90 million hits a month. So I continue to keep it in. Although I don't know if you can see this, but I had a terrible motorcycle accident during my desert racing era, and I put my arm through my hand. So I actually had to teach myself to draw and write again, and I now have this sort of slightly looser, naive style. And what I did in this book is I took these fabulous vintage etchings, all of which I have the originals of, and then I added my own touch, a little cartoon eye on each one, in order to control the mood and the picture of the essence of each image.
Wait a minute. So I'm not understanding you here. When you say these vintage etchings which you had, are you telling me that some of these etchings, some of the illustrations in this book are not yours?
These are 300 years old. These are all the real thing, and all I have done is anthropomorphize them by adding these eyes and expressions and a touch of blush.
Okay, so the drawings are not yours. We've established that to some extent. The words, however, are yours. Why these curses and blessings now? What prompted this?
This little book started as an experiment. I was introduced to Twitter and Facebook. And I'm something of, this sort of furry Luddite, and I struggled with it. And when I finally tapped into it, I realized there was an audience there that was worth engaging with. There is a collective digital mind online. And I wanted to engage with it. But there's also a lot of rubbish. And I was very disappointed when I saw this this acrostic gibberish sort of perversely thumbed into oxymoronic smartphones by thick-fingered nose pickers. And I just thought, this is crap. Can't we do something clever and funny in 60 words or less, or whatever it is, how many characters it is?
140.
140, thank you. And so I started doing these as an online thing, as a Twitter curses and blessing exercise, and got quite a following and had a lot of fun with it. And, obviously there's some sort of snobbish precedent for this. You think Hemingway said you should be able to tell a story in 6 words or less. Was that what he said? Was it baby shoes for sale, never worn? That's how he won a bar bet, created a narrative in 6 words. And then, of course, you have wonderful examples of, historic examples of wit in the past. But I've also loved the sententious verbiage you find for example, in the epimetheums and Aesop's fables. So at the end, they just spell it out to you, this sort of obvious thing. And I love the idea of having fun and celebrating laughter and language using curses and insults, because there's a lot of people that need to be cursed. And also a number of us in need of a blessing.
Let me take you back to the Blue Day book for a moment that started this whole thing for you. I'm guessing that it was an absolutely unequivocal blessing. Or was it? Was there an element of curse in it?
What you're referring to is the fact that I now have the ignominious distinction of being the god of gift books. The most successful gift book author of all time. And people keep wanting the same thing. And quite frankly, I was very happy to give them that as long as I enjoyed it, which I did enjoy it. 21 titles in the Blue Day series, which was a lot of fun. And of course, it became very frustrating because there were so many, even my own publishers, producing knockoff editions. And what started out as a very cute, original little thing is now an industry standard. And people would, confuse my books with someone else's by the virtue of their format, which is not a problem you have in any other aspect of publishing. Not that I, compare myself to Proust or anybody else. People don't look at me and go, "Oh my God, it's Henrik Ibsen." No one ever says that. But it's a little bit of a curse in that there was an insatiable demand for the same sort of thing, and for my sins, I gratefully agreed to that. And I don't regret it because it opened many opportunities. The commercial success of that series, and I'm proud of all of them. Every little book, however modest, contains a little piece of your soul, and I love those books. And it opened the world to me. I was able to transfer that success into other ventures that I'm passionate about, literacy and also wildlife conservation.
I know that you're very passionate about endangered species, and I know you're also very passionate about poetry. Do you think of poetry as an endangered species?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And if you think of the most threatened of any creatures, it's always those at the top or the bottom. And it's the little pieces that hold it all together, or it's the apex creatures, the apex predators. And poetry is the highest form of language, and therefore it's always the least stable. It's the most vulnerable because it requires everything else to be in place for it to shine. Think of it as the star on top of a Christmas tree. And so, yes, it very much is. And one of the areas that we've yet to see in online publishing is the engagement of the audience. We're starting to see a little bit now with fan writing, fan novels, fanzines, and I'm hoping that will continue, this idea of participation. But at the moment, what we see is everybody wants to write and nobody wants to read. And we've got to develop that culture where, no, you really have to be a reader first.
I can't think of the blessing or the curse to finish this interview with, but I'm sure you've got one.
Well, you know what? One of my favorite, the most famous, is the Apocryphal Curse, which is "May you live in interesting times," which we think sort of came up around the time of the Chinese famines in the 1930s. But I prefer rather ambiguous blessings and curses, just like that. We don't know where it's going to go. And my favorite out of this book, my favorite blessing, is "May you be able to read in bed by the light of your soul."
Yeah, I really like that one too. Thank you very much, BTG.
It's a pleasure, Caroline.
This may be a slim volume, but it's a perfect gift, and it's also a great way to start a game, because creating your own cursings and blessings is actually harder than you might think.